So thank you, Anna, for the kind introduction. As a long-time supporter of TRAC, it's a great pleasure for me to be invited to present in this webinar series. So I have got some labels on my screen, so I'm just checking that they're not visible to everybody else. Let's start again here. My main arguments today will be familiar to a degree to anyone who's followed my outputs over the years. There are several strands to this talk. First, I shall provide some autobiographical reflections on the threads that bind together some of my major works relating to imperialism and colonialism. This represents a long journey through changing intellectual and physical landscapes. I'll then go on to make some general points about theoretical issues relating to the Roman Empire and how we might attempt to decolonize the story of North Africa in particular. Finally, I'll use a few examples of arguments from the book to illustrate my methods in action. My first major exploration of post-colonial agendas came in Dialogues in Imperialism, 1997. Then in An Imperial Possession, Britain in the Roman Empire in 2006, I sought to challenge orthodox academic and public perceptions of a Roman province. The methods employed there were further elaborated in Imperialism, Power and Identity, Experiencing the Roman Empire in 2011, reflecting on various aspects of identity presentation and the operation of Roman colonialism. As explained in the preface of that book, my work seeks to explore, quote, the space between the historiography of classical archaeology and post-colonial studies, end quote. My new book, Between Sahara and Sea, Africa and the Roman Empire, coming out in August this year, is in many respects a companion piece to Imperial Possession, but it also reflects how my thinking about the Roman Empire has continued to evolve over the last 20 years. I shall take a few minutes to reflect on the writing of the two provincial case studies in particular. From the mid-1990s, I became increasingly engaged with post-colonial thinking and exploring how such ideas might be operationalized in Roman archaeology. Imperial Possession was my first attempt to employ this thinking in a large-scale study. At its heart was a rejection of the conventional paradigm of Romanization and an exploration of how an alternative concept of discrepant identity could facilitate a more nuanced reading of the evidence. Imperial Possession was structured in 5 parts. An introductory section considered the nature of the source evidence for writing Britain's history under Roman rule, and the theoretical approaches that I chose to follow, as well as presenting the Iron Age background to the Roman conquest. The majority of the book comprised a tripartite review of the story of Britain in the Roman Empire from 3 different perspectives, that of the Roman military, the urban populations, and the Roman rural communities, including peoples lying outside provincial territory. This revealed that these groups followed distinctive cultural trajectories. The final part of the book looked at the cross-cutting theme of the economic impacts of empire and the end of imperial rule in the early 5th century, as well as demonstrating overall divergence between the military, urban and rural communities. I reflected on regional and social differences within these broad groups and on change over time, producing, I hope, a much more complicated set of interactions and impacts over nearly 4 centuries of colonial rule than the simplistic Romanization model tends to depict. I attempted to show that alongside the winners and active participants in the colonial project, there were numerous people who experienced loss or oppression as subjects of empire. Reviewers and readers have reacted variously to this critical examination of the impact of an imperial system on a provincial population. And the unconventional approaches that I took in the book. However, positive reactions have balanced negative responses. At the heart of some of the harsher criticism has been an accusation, explicit or implicit, that I do not like the Romans. And I've always found such comments unnerving and astonishing, given that my official title as Professor of Roman Archaeology amply reflects my utter fascination for the subject. As a trained historian, I would also highlight the dangers of being too much in love with or in awe of one's subject. The cozy nostalgia of the Roman Empire for the Roman Empire that characterizes a lot of conventional study, to my mind, lacks critical edge and is increasingly out of step with wider societal thinking about empires and colonialism today. After all, the facts of Rome's negative impacts on her subject peoples are not really in doubt from our ancient sources. These are full of wars, sackings, enslavements, extortion, abuses of power, and so on. The historian's job, it seems to me, is not to make moral judgments about whether the empire was a good or a bad thing, but rather to delineate how it achieved what it did for the benefit of which people and at the expense of which others. Nor is history an exact science with a single objective truth to be reconstructed for all time. Precisely because of the incompleteness of the record, it is open to subjectivity in filling in gaps and also to underlying subconscious assumptions that can shape the narrative. Each generation of researchers thus reinterprets the historical record, in part reflecting changes in the modern world. This can lead to accusations of presentism, of course, but to my mind, the opposite tendency of withholding critique of the underpinnings of past scholarship is also deeply problematic, where it allows outmoded assumptions to continue to inform interpretation. The need for such reflection and revision is all the greater where past scholarship can be seen to have been shaped, and in the eyes of some tainted, by modern colonial projects. It is thus ever more important, I think, for historians and archaeologists to reflect on the unconscious bias that lies behind the presentation of evidence, to acknowledge their own influences, and to deconstruct hidden discourses of historical orthodoxy. In the 21st century, it's incumbent, I think, on researchers to adopt more critical approaches to Roman imperialism and to attempt to frame debate about Rome's provinces in new ways. This was, of course, a prime motivation behind the rise of TRAC in the first place. My new book has grown like Topsy from 4 lectures given as the 2013 Jerome Lecture Series, and it's not possible to summarize all aspects of a nearly 750-page tome in a short lecture such as this. In their totality, the North African lands form the remarkably successful southern territories of the Roman Empire. They were surprising and paradoxical lands in that their richness, based primarily on agricultural productivity, belied their somewhat difficult mountainous terrain, a variable climate, and a deep desert backdrop. Although seemingly far from a central concern at Rome, by the 2nd century CE, Africa had become a critical driver of the empire. In economic terms, this is reflected in its major contribution to Rome's grain supply, but also in the evident boom in olive oil production, along with large exports of wine and fish products. The region boasted one of the highest densities of urban centres anywhere in the empire. The political and social impacts centred to some degree on hundreds of men who entered imperial service as equestrians and senators, including several who became emperors or would-be emperors. When Christianity became the official religion of the empire in the 4th century, Africa was one of its main seedbeds and produced a series of key figures in the early church. My structure for Between Sahara and Sea is designed to challenge some orthodox interpretations, as I shall go on to explain. In the extended introductory section, I diagnose the weaknesses of traditional preoccupations and highlight new theoretical approaches. The second part presents a detailed review of the developments of the first millennium BCE, using much recently published research that demonstrates that, contrary to long-held belief, Africa had well-established urban and agricultural traditions on which Rome was to build. The following three sections then replicate my structure for imperial possession in looking in detail at the military, urban, and rural communities. Once again, this reveals radically different cultural outcomes across these groups, but also long-maintained influences of the major pre-Roman population groups and regional divergences as well. The final section reviews economic differentiation and then provides an overall synthesis. While delineating a new framework for interpretation, I also endeavored to review the state of the field in a way that demonstrated how the mass of data assembled under outmoded agendas can be reinterpreted and repurposed. Decisions had to be taken about the geographic and chronological limits of the book. I focus on North Africa, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Greater Sirtic Gulf in Libya, with occasional forays further east to Cyrenaica and Marmarica, but also a good deal more attention paid to the desert zone than in most previous books. The chronological emphasis is on the formative centuries of the Roman occupation, broadly 2nd century BCE to 3rd century CE, but I engage also with earlier and later events where it helps the understanding of this core Roman era. The underpinning agenda of 20th century Roman archaeology in Britain and North Africa was shaped in the 19th and early 20th century heyday of modern empires. Western scholars unquestionably accepted the appropriateness of colonial rule and sought profit in tracing in the Roman past aspects of colonial systems familiar to them from their present-day experience. It's unsurprising that the focus of archaeological work was on urban monuments, mosaics, and other artworks, epigraphic evidence, elite houses, and Roman military bases. There was a predisposition to portray pre-Roman society as primitive, passively receiving the benefits of imported ideas and technologies brought by Roman colonists and paternalistic governors. On the other hand, it's also clear that there were some profound differences between Britain and North Africa. The former was a great modern imperial power, and its ancient population was to a degree more sympathetically portrayed as being put on the path towards civilization and future greatness by the Roman interlude. In North Africa, the emphasis has been much more overtly on external agents of change, with modern French and Italian ventures portrayed as a reclamation of former lands and entitlements. This also involved an explicit attempt to disinherit the indigenous populations from any positive role in the Roman past. Such colonialist assumptions have had long historiographical consequences. For the French in Algeria and Tunisia, and the Italians in Libya, the Roman period marked a prior episode of colonial rule to which modern imperial adventurers were seen as hereditary successors. The modern colonial discourse thus became deeply entangled with the ancient one, leading to strong feelings of disassociation and alienation with the Roman heritage for the region's non-European majority populations. The modern colonial regimes in North Africa gave further impetus to the Romano-centric vision, with a particular emphasis on the notion of Romanization as both a palliative and compensation for subjugation. The modern European view of ancient North Africa was thus firmly built on a colonialist discourse that has been long enduring in the post-colonial era. To better understand this, we need to first recognize that there were in fact three separate colonial discourses in relation to the Roman Empire. The first relates to how the Romans considered and justified their own imperial power. This was no doubt less sophisticated than the modern justificatory political science discourses of imperialism and colonialism, but nonetheless, there are common elements. The Romans frequently cited divine sanction of their empire and of their civilizing mission. The imperatives of ruling far-flung provinces were typically contextualized in terms of advancement for provincial societies and the Pax Romana. The economics of imperial exploitation are more rarely mentioned in our sources, and Roman interventions are generally presented as defensive reactions to external enemies or fanatical rebels. The symptoms of such a discourse are evident in the distortions of the texts that portray Africa's landscapes as desertic, empty, underdeveloped, and its peoples as uniformly barbaric or unsettled in the pre-Roman period. The Africa discovered by our sources was in effect presented as a virgin landscape in need of sensible and intelligent outsiders to allow it to be developed for the benefit of benighted Africans. The second discourse concerns the modern colonial justifications of contemporary imperial projects. This was especially important in that it created a body of dogma about the appropriateness of imperialism and the rights and duties of colonizing powers. In North Africa, the close collaboration between the modern colonial regimes and archaeologists, epigraphers, and historians inevitably developed this further into a third specific discourse in which there was much direct drawing of parallels and lessons from ancient to modern colonialism and vice versa. Here, the interpretation of the ancient sources and of the past history was underpinned by a host of shared understandings and value judgments about the imperial project. This was the intellectual climate in which Haverfield produced the concept of Romanization, a perfect tool for eliding history to best fit a preconceived sense of the lessons of imperial history and the benefits of colonial rule. The discourse problem is further exacerbated by increasingly urgent and angry debates within classical studies today. These concern perceptions of racism, sexism, and elitism, whose ultimate origins can be traced back to the formative impact of the modern colonial era on the discipline's agendas. I think we're beginning to see an ugly divide between those who want reform and change in the discipline and those who remain in denial of the issues and who are quick to condemn perceived wokery at work. The shocking lack of diversity in the academy is a symptom of the structural impediments and inbuilt conservatism. A highly publicized clash at the 2019 US Society for Classical Studies conference, where there was a session on the future of classics, is an example of the danger that this poses. The very idea of Western civilization and what it represents in terms of cultural appropriation is also increasingly being challenged. On the other side of the equation, and giving pause for thought about who classicists should wish to be keeping company with, are white supremacist groups and right-wing anti-woke commentators defending traditional classics as part of a culture war and misrepresenting the discipline for nefarious purposes. For this reason, I believe it's not only right to reevaluate the colonialist underpinnings of our discipline, but also necessary and urgent to take these steps to decolonize the discipline. To take this further, let us consider terms used to characterize aspects of what I see as a long-running debate in relation to North Africa: colonial, anti-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial, neocolonial. Though anti-colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial are sometimes used as synonyms, I prefer to use these more as phases in an evolving argument about colonialism. Colonial or colonialist approaches evoke the modern colonial era, where exogenous forces were highlighted above all else as responsible for positive achievements. Then came an anti-colonial reaction that gained pace in the early post-independence years, and that instead stressed local resistance to Rome as the key characteristic. This then evolved into a reflective post-colonial era, particularly typified by Marcel Benabou's book, though one in which change has been slower and less far-going than hoped for. And I'd like to think that we are now entering a fourth phase where a more sophisticated deconstruction of colonialist thinking can be undertaken. This links to decolonizing archaeology, not just in conceptual and methodological terms, but also in the structural inequalities through which North African archaeologists and communities have too often been marginalized. On the other hand, elements of the former colonialist agenda persist still in what we might term a neo-colonial approach. The different phases of debate have engendered a series of binary oppositions that are all to some degree a product of these entangled discourses. It might be objected that the modern colonial era is far behind us and that my anxieties are unfounded or exaggerated. But a new relevance for ancient Africa came with the addition of l'Afrique romane de l'Antiquité de l'Atlantique à la Tripolitaine as a subject for the French concours in 2005. This massively increased the teaching of the subject in French universities and led to a glut of new titles on l'Afrique romane in the following years. However, close perusal of these books reveals that the underlying agenda is actually not that much changed since the modern colonial era. These remain very much top-down accounts focused on the achievement of empire in North Africa. One reason for this emphasis, as Sanguera noted, was, quote, that the 2005 law compelled places of education to teach the positive aspects of French imperialism, end quote. Evidently, there's been little appetite, in any case, among the French Academy to deconstruct the rationale behind the established agenda. As noted, most previous work on Roman Africa has tended to present Africa seen from an outside, essentially Roman perspective. The approach highlights, above all, the influence of the Mediterranean Sea and the people, technologies, and contacts that came across it to transform North Africa. Indigenous agency has been minimized, and the influence of the desert on the society and civilization that emerged has been seen as purely environmental rather than cultural. 60 years beyond the end of the last European empires in North Africa, I think it's vital that the study of Africa in the Roman era recalibrates its agendas and specifically takes the necessary steps to decolonize the scholarly discourse. I thus challenge myself to try and find a rather different story to these expurgated visions of Roman Africa. Part of the way in which the colonial discourse is to be deconstructed, I suggest, is through a franker acknowledgement of the negative impacts of empires, including that of ancient Rome, whether through war, enslavement, provincial exploitation, or the petty acts born out of power inequalities that are present in everyday situations. One of the objections that can be raised about the standard vision of l'Afrique romane is that it prioritizes the history of Europeans in Africa rather than the African history per se. As the Hugh Trevor Roper quote shows, the seeds of this can be traced in modern Eurocentric and frankly racist attitudes. But nor should we throw up our hands in despair at the inadequacies of conventional historical sources, as Wolf seems to be implying, when we still have access to archaeology to provide an alternative transcripts of the lives that were lived. As with Imperial Possession, I set out to write a more inclusive story of diverse peoples in a provincial region and their relation to the Roman Empire, rather than to describe Roman Africa, which, as noted, has tended to be a very partial and top-down view of the society. In Imperial Possession, I tried to avoid the term Roman Britain, and in between Sahara and Sea, I only employ Roman Africa in inverted commas, seeing these terms as simplistic shorthand for the colonialist perspective on Roman provincial stories. Rather than being clumsy synonyms for Roman Britain and Roman Africa, then, my preferred alternatives, Britain in the Roman Empire and Africa in the Roman Empire, are intended to have quite different meanings and connotations. I fear I must apologize at this stage for having a slide about Romanization again. People still seem to be split into two camps on this term. On the one hand, there are those who think the arguments for its cancellation are now unanswerable. On the other, there are those who are equally sure that the concept retains its central importance to our discipline, and wish people like me would shut up about it. Romanization has indeed been the key organizing concept of study, though we may note that French archaeologists applied the term in different ways in Africa compared to in France, and this is part of the problem. This resulted in divergent narratives. The Gallic story highlights the integration and agency of indigenous Gallic peoples, contrasting with a predominant emphasis on external influences and actors in Africa. This required a crude characterization of the limitations of North African societies when it came to their appreciation or participation in the perceived advantages of civilized Roman life. Romanization, as I've said, has proved remarkably resilient to change, despite its widely recognized problems. There's been little critical reflection on the issue in Francophone or Italian scholarship on North Africa. Romanization in only slightly modified form remains a central paradigm in the numerous recent books on l'Afrique romaine. This leads to highly simplistic characterization of the population of the African provinces, as in the typical quote on the screen. In my list of objections to Romanization, I think the links with the modern colonialist discourse are particularly insidious and problematic. The term and the tradition of study associated with it has become an obstacle to reforming or widening the fundamental agenda of the discipline. Romanization is thus employed in Between Sahara and Sea only in terms of illustrating its interpretational deficiencies. My favorite alternative to Romanization is to use well-established frameworks of postcolonial and identity theory to look afresh at the cultural changes within the Roman Empire. I examine Africa in the Roman world in terms of its multiple and changing identities, what I have termed discrepant identity, drawing on ideas of social memory and articulated social relations. The Roman Empire was a world of profound regional differences, informed by varied historical and social trajectories, as well as by power structures that were imposed by Rome. Communities and individuals engaged in practices of code switching from local to cosmopolitan identity and vice versa in many situations. Cultural change was thus multidirectional rather than following in a single inexorable movement in one direction towards colonial emulation, if you like. Over recent decades, identity has become a key concept in archaeological research, with a particular focus on how this relates to cultural hybridity. Identities can perhaps be thought of as flexible, like the choice of clothing or strategies of bilingualism. By changing costume or language, people can signal a switch in their identity display. Code switching has been recognized as an important aspect of plural identity presentation. The idea is also being applied to artifacts and other aspects of identity construction. My ideas regarding discrepant identity focus particularly on how individuals and groups use things like language, material culture, and behaviors to differentiate themselves from others in society, rather than simply emphasizing the commonalities of culture that Romanization has tended to focus on. This slide summarizes some of my thoughts about how we might actively start to decolonize classical archaeology in North Africa. As an aging white male from a former colonial power, I recognize the difficulties of perception and legitimacy imposed by my nationality, my educational background, and my more restricted personal experience of colonial inequality. But I strongly believe it's incumbent on all of us engaged in the study of the past to attempt to grapple with the issues raised about colonialism. I don't have time to address all the points on the slide today, but I'll highlight a few only that are illustrative of my approach. The lack of a fully developed Iron Age archaeology for North Africa has certainly hampered the ability to push back against colonialist emphasis on exogenous achievement and endogenous passivity. Despite the initial anti-colonial backlash stressing native resistance as a counter to the colonialist vision of Roman Africa, the traditional agendas and preoccupations of study have, as I've said, remained little changed. Many classical archaeologists from Maghrebian countries still remain broadly supportive or sympathetic of the orthodox agenda, and this is a natural result in many ways of their training within this tradition. But for most North Africans, the Roman past remains something alien, perhaps useful in terms of tourism revenues, but not truly an integral part of their own cultural heritage. That has created a huge gulf between academic agendas and popular perceptions. In my new book, I suggest that to enable a different connection between the present populations of North Africa and their past, it is first necessary to address the academic frameworks that rationalize and maintain unfair social structures. Whatever the impact of initiatives by people like me, the decolonizing of the discipline will ultimately depend to a far greater extent on the work of North African researchers, particularly as they broaden their own frame of research. Key aspect here is going beyond research, pushing the research agendas beyond the traditional foci of Roman Africa, and in particular, seeing a greater interest in rural landscapes and communities, as in the work of these two PhD students from Libya. Decolonizing the discipline needs to be pursued both in our research and in the classroom simultaneously. One of the problems, though, with having an outmoded narrative framework for a subject is that it can be practically difficult to teach it in a new way. We should thus celebrate the appearance last year of the Blackwell Companion to North Africa in Antiquity, edited by Bruce Hitchner. It prompted me last year to inaugurate with Bruce a transatlantic experimental seminar course at our two universities, exploring the North African material through an explicit decolonizing lens. For me, this was long overdue, and the positive engagement and reactions from a very diverse student body confirmed for me that this is the right direction for the discipline. The big issue is how we are still constrained by a vocabulary that has too many distinctly colonialist overtones. Even researchers committed to the idea of moving on from colonialist models can find it hard to escape from vocabulary that has so much colonial baggage. It's no surprise in these circumstances that our readers and students all too easily revert to the traditional default assumptions that follow from it. Here's a simple colonial bingo card for you to test out in other academic settings. Just listen or look for the trigger words. During the writing of Between Sahara and Sea, I experimented with systematically removing these terms and concepts that I was finding problematic. So in place of Roman Africa, native, tribe, proto-history, Romanization, frontier, slave, and nomad from the traditional scholarly vocabulary, I've used Africa in the Roman Empire, local, people, North African Iron Age, or the NAIA, discrepant identity, security zone, enslaved person, pastoralist. The first group of terms, as I say, come with a lot of modern colonial baggage, or are increasingly discredited in scholarly use today. The casual use of the first group of terms in scholarship more generally accounts for many lazy assumptions. To give a specific example, I spent over 25 years amassing the evidence to demonstrate, I think pretty conclusively, that the Saharan people known as the Garamantes created hundreds of sedentary oasis village settlements, that their most significant settlements were urban in scale and function, and that under the rule of their kings, who were clients of Rome, we think, they merit consideration as an early Saharan polity. Yet they are still recurrently referred to in the literature as nomadic, barbarian, and tribal. The suggestion I change frontier to security zone arose out of discussion with Bruce Hitchner, but it makes perfect sense in that by writing primarily of frontiers in a Roman context, we sustain an ancient fiction that its army's purpose was to defend Roman territory and Roman people from external barbarian other. However, in fact, the Roman deployments were at least as much about control of territory and peoples within the provincial borders. It's time to provide some concrete examples from the book to illustrate my approaches. The autochthonous peoples of North Africa have hitherto been underrepresented in the story of Roman Africa. The Iron Age group that has tended to get the most scholarly attention is the Libyphonices, represented at coastal settlements. In colonialist thinking, they are an allowable exception, as they represent a pre-Roman intervention by another colonizing society, the Phoenicians. Note the quote on the slide for the denigrating use of the term protohistoric and the emphasis on the role of outsiders over locals. The Libby element of such settlements has not received nearly enough attention in my view. More importantly, despite the existence of hundreds of ethnic group names covering the Maghreb and northern Sahara in antiquity, during the first millennium BCE, several large blocks emerged that seem to have had larger significance. The Numidae of the northeast Maghreb were formed from the union of two peoples, the Masaicili and the Masili, with a third group, the Maori, in the far western Maghreb. The Numidae and the Maori both constituted important states under kingly rule by the late first millennium BCE, though in modern accounts there is still a marked tendency to deny these kingdoms any sophistication and scale. However, the most extensive version of the Numidian kingdom was an exceptionally large Iron Age polity, covering 230,000 square kilometers, comparable in size to the great Mesoamerican early states and 50 to 100 times larger than the average city-states of ancient Greece. After the fall of this kingdom in 46 BCE, when Juba I took the wrong side in Rome's civil war, the eastern territory of the Masili was annexed as a new Roman province, and the western territory of the Masaicili added to the Mauritanian kingdom. Later, this Mauritanian territory would form the basis of two Roman provinces. To the south of the Maori and Numidae were peoples of the mountains and pre-desert and northern Saharan landscapes, known collectively in our sources as Gaetuli. Though we know that these comprise multiple local groups with distinct ethnic names, there are strong reasons to believe that these peoples shared a language and other cultural traits in ways that made them distinct from the peoples further to the north. Further out into the desert, there were groups described as Aethiopes, Black Africans, and named desert populations such as the Garamantes, Nazamones, and Marmaridae. The apparent neat separation of desert peoples between Black Africans and Berber or Mediterranean African groups is no doubt a gross oversimplification. In reality, the desert peoples were probably from an early date made up of groups of a fairly mixed skin color range. The ancient accounts of all these African peoples, including the Maori and the Numidae, highlighted their nomadic practices, their primitive culture, their warlike tendencies, classic othering techniques, and this verdict was eagerly adopted in modern colonialist perspectives. As we shall see, the reality was much more complicated. There's been a common modern perception that the miracle of the Roman era boom in agriculture and urbanization was essentially attributable to external stimuli and actors. Through a colonial intervention and transmission, Greeks, Phoenicians, and Romans. The corollary is that the natural conditions of African society and land has been portrayed as one of an underdeveloped wildscape, thinly inhabited by pastoral nomads, prior to the transmission of new technologies, farming, metallurgy, and urban institutions brought through contact with Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans. This model envisaged urbanization and agriculture was spreading from the coast, initially into areas under Carthaginian control and later into territory opened up by Roman conquests. For long, we've lacked the archaeological evidence to evaluate such claims fully, but we're now in a position, I think, to debunk such views decisively. The distribution of urban settlement in the Roman Empire highlights a number of zones as having particularly high densities of towns: southern Spain, Italy, the Aegean, Asia Minor, the Levant, the Nile Delta, and the region of Africa previously occupied by Carthage in the Eastern Numidian Kingdom. Now, leaving Africa to one side, the other areas are all ones of notably early pre-Roman urban origins and evolved networks. We're now starting to identify significant indications of urban development in inland Africa as well, from the early first millennium BCE. Many urban sites of the Roman era occupy distinctive topographic positions on narrow peninsulas surrounded by steep-sided dry rivers, wadis, or cliffs or other escarpments. Other indications at many of these sites, such as Iron Age II monuments clustered close by, and occasional source references, encourage the identification of these sites as proto-urban or early urban in character during the pre-Roman Iron Age. This is now proven by remarkable excavations at the small town of Altheburus, where a sequence of substantial stone-footed rectangular buildings continue to a depth of 5 meters below the Roman levels, yielding radiocarbon dates from the earliest levels of around 1000 BCE. From the 10th to 9th century levels came a range of agricultural remains, showing that some elements of the Numidae were sedentary cultivators from such an early date. Similar early developments are being recognized at many other sites now. Of particular importance is the fact that the radiocarbon dates for these inland urban developments predate the first certainly identified archaeological traces of Phoenician settlements on the coast. And in any event, Libya-Phoenician coastal settlements appear to have been relatively few in number until around 500 BCE. A second demonstration of precocious settlement and agricultural development has come from my own work on the Garamantes of the Libyan Sahara. Around 1,000 kilometers beyond the reach of Mediterranean colonists, we might note. Following on from early first millennium BCE hill fort settlements associated from the start with oasis agriculture, Garamantian oasis communities expanded massively from the 4th century BCE onwards, with the appearance of hundreds of villages and some towns. The suite of cultivated plants here was different to that in the Numidian heartlands, and again it's difficult to reconcile these developments with the impact or influence of Mediterranean colonists. My argument is thus that North Africa was much more widely developed in terms of its urban settlement and agricultural initiatives, including many desert oases, prior to the Roman era. Pathways to urbanism and agriculture differed across North Africa, but we can be sure that a significant factor in the Roman boom in urbanism and crop production was the fact that both urbanism and agriculture were well established among local populations prior to the formation of those Roman provinces. This doesn't change the fact that the Roman era saw substantial growth and development in these socioeconomic aspects, but our explanation of these phenomena must now start in a very different place. There are significant implications from this for our understanding of the evolution of the urban form in Africa under Rome. While there are towns whose rigid gridded lines, as on the left of the slide here, and whose monumental embellishments echo a Roman model recognizable in many other provinces, I would also point to the fact that the plans of towns in the center and right of the slide are more typical examples of the urban topography in North Africa. These sites on defensible peninsulas or hilltops with a haphazard maze of alley-like streets reflect the pre-Roman urban sites that underlie them, and we're only just starting to investigate these aspects. However, in some cases, we have evidence of the imposition of groups of Roman citizens or veterans alongside local populations, evidently creating two-tier societies and enabling a form of urbanization that Lisa Fentress has memorably described as coercive. The rural landscapes of ancient Africa, for long neglected in archaeological research, have been increasingly subject to modern field survey in recent decades, now backed up by enhanced remote sensing enabled by the availability of high-resolution satellite imagery. There are still some major gaps and a dearth of excavations of rural settlements, but the diversity of Africa in the Roman Empire is most evident in relation to the rural community and the evidence produced by this archaeological research. While rural landscapes can tell stories of pre-Roman evolution and continuities, they also reveal some of the largest impacts of the colonial project. In the first territory annexed by Rome, what became the province of Africa Vetus, Roman land surveyors restructured fundamentally 160,000 square kilometers of land by a series of massive gridded centuriation schemes. Though subsequent territorial expansions were not demarcated in quite the same way, there is abundant evidence of the continuing activity of Roman surveyors defining lands, reassigning them to towns and peoples by imperial diktat, creating huge imperial estates, and so on. The long-term impacts of such intrusion into prior landholding arrangements can be illustrated by reference to rural epigraphic practices. In this slide, I compare and contrast the high incidence of rural Latin epigraphy around the town of Thugga in northern Tunisia with the vast area of Tripolitania in northwestern Libya. There are 92 Latin inscriptions in 80 square kilometers around Thugga, and this compares with less than half that number in the 200,000 square kilometers of Tripolitania. The latter region also shows engagement with other epigraphic languages in practice. The high incidence of rural Latinity around Thugga is hard to disconnect from the colonial impact of land there being incorporated first into large private estates and then into imperial estates, and the attachment to Thugga of a pagus of Roman citizen settlements. The academic priority accorded to recording of Latin inscriptions has also tended to underestimate the importance of Punic and Latin languages, especially in the countryside. There's now a growing corpus of Libyan texts to show that the epigraphic habit extended well beyond its presumed limits and even beyond the uptake of Latinity, reflecting longevity of non-Latin languages in North Africa. Modern linguistic preferences show the continuation of multilingual practices as an essential element of identity projection. Another crucial area for identifying regional and communal differences concerns religious practice. The slide illustrates the distribution of evidence relating to the cult of Baal Hamon and its Roman equivalent, African Saturn, as evidenced by the finds of tophets, temples, and stelae, and by inscriptional evidence. Hitherto unremarked is a correlation of the strongest part of the distribution with the lands of the eastern Numidian peoples and the territory of Carthage in northeastern Tunisia. With the exception of some coastal Libyo-Phoenician centres and military sites, it is largely absent from the Gaetulian lands and those associated with the western Numidian and Mauritanian kingdom to the west. So why was this? Matt McCarthy's work has shown that the major growth in the spread of the cult post-dated the fall of Carthage in 146 BCE, and thus relates to the time when Roman rule was already established in Africa. It's tempting to see its popularity in the lands that were next to be annexed by Rome as a sort of nonconformist reaction to Rome's looming presence. In effect, an invention of tradition or reinvigoration of religious identity given impetus by the perils of the imperial context. The limits to its spread may have related to a specific aspect of the Saturn cult, child sacrifice, which required a high tariff from its adherents and which may have presented obstacles to its wider adoption by Gaetulian Maori. However, we have other archaeological evidence to show that those groups also had different mechanisms for negotiating with chthonic gods and forces, and ones that didn't, presumably, involve sacrificing their children. Finally, let me show you a series of examples of the sorts of different identity markers of a number of Africans negotiating their lifeways under Roman rule. I prioritized individuals of demonstrable indigenous origins, though of course Roman migrant families are of equal interest for understanding the full spectrum of identity presentations. Annabalta Papias Rufus was a Libya-Phoenician aristocrat at Leptis Magna in the Augustan era, who made significant donations to monumentalizing his hometown in Roman style. I would characterize him as an early adopter of Roman manners and behaviors, but note that the bilingual form of his dedications and his names clearly also anchor him to the local community, which was notable for the lack of Roman settler families. Maria Plancina was commemorated in a funerary verse by her Roman citizen husband, who was of Numidian descent, to judge by his name, his cognomen. Although the text is at one level deeply connected with standard Roman conventions about Roman matrons, best of women, good mother, good wife, there is a twist here in that the inscription twice identifies her as being of royal Numidian descent. Now, the date of the inscription isn't entirely clear, but it probably dates to the later 2nd century CE. That's more than 200 years after the annexation of the Numidian kingdom by Rome. Sicca Veneria was a Roman colony created by adding a deduction of veterans to an already established Numidian urban community. And it's in this context that I think we need to recognize the importance of this remembered Numidian royal status. The settler families may well have enjoyed some social advantages in the town, at least initially, but Plancina is claimed to be above and beyond other women through her royal heritage. This seems a great example of how the African part of a woman's identity retained cultural value long into the Roman period. Keti, son of Masalwalat, provides another example of cultural dualism and code switching. His funerary inscription was executed in both Latin and Libyan, but provided different versions of his persona for posterity. As Gaius Julius Gaetulus, he was a decorated Roman veteran who enjoyed a long retirement career as a local notable and priest in his hometown of Thulium in northeastern Algeria. The military identity is diluted here by his decades of retirement, with no allusion to his unit or his rank. The Libyan text gives his distinctly different Libyan names and filiation, mentions in somewhat elliptical form his service to the emperor, but focuses mainly on his ethnic identity. The Misakiri were probably a subgroup of the Numidae, despite the cognomen hinting at Gaetulian links. Marsaucan, son of Ulul, was a Gaetulian from the Libyan pre-desert. He's known from the inscription in Latino Punic that decorated his elaborate mausoleum. Evidently a prominent local landowner, there's no suggestion that he was a Roman citizen or that he even necessarily spoke Latin. The architecture and relief carvings on the mausoleum evoke classical styles to a degree, but in distinctly regional variants. Although his status and lands no doubt resulted from colonial interventions and arrangements, there's little that is explicitly Roman on display here. Hopefully, what these few examples demonstrate are the complexities of expressing identity and the long continuing importance for some groups of pre-Roman identity traits. Wolff has suggested that a common failure of post-colonial approaches to the Roman Empire has been the replacement of the emphasis on the civilizing process with a focus on domination and exploitation. I would argue that decolonizing history involves recognizing a diversity of perspectives and thus striking a balance in critical analysis between both positive and negative aspects of ancient imperialisms and the engagements of individuals with the Roman Empire. I am also more concerned by the alternative of simply persisting with traditional top-down narratives. while our literary sources and epigraphic data are inevitably slanted in favour of people who by social status or education were situated more towards the Roman end of a broad social spectrum, there are a number of ways in which I've tried to counter these imbalances in the evidence. The first is to make greater use of a wider range of archaeological evidence than is often considered, looking beyond the monumental architecture, the high-end art, to reflect on local and discrepant ways in which material culture was used and prioritized. The second has been to develop a step-by-step critique of the written sources, focused on the identification and disentanglement of colonial discourses that underlies the way in which material has tended to be presented and understood. In my work, I draw attention to how the different ways of being Roman reflected the place of individuals within the imperial power structures. I also emphasize that identity was often used in a relational manner to mark boundaries and differences between people rather than similarity. Romanization theory has obscured this, but an important advantage of identity theory is the way it allows us to appreciate that differentiation and the creation of distance from other groups in society was often more important than emulation for some groups. The complexities of multiple identities require us to reflect on how higher order group identities might have been shaped in the Roman Empire. The crucial point is that for most people in antiquity, there was no singular identity affiliation that outweighed all others. This is something that makes the Roman Empire very different from the modern world, I think. In the modern age, there's tended to be much more importance placed on nationalistic identities or overarching religious affiliations, for instance. Finally, an interplay between local and global influences is particularly pertinent in the case of Roman provincial societies, as Imperial Possession and Between Sahara and Sea have tried to demonstrate. Thank you.